Chapter 18 of The Boy Scouts in the Trappers' Camp by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Smoking Out the Indian. Pat and Alec returned to their captive. Alec acted as spokesman, speaking the patois of the Canuck or French Canadian fluently, while the Frenchman spoke English but little, and that very brokenly. Alec repeated his previously made charges of theft from the traps, and also of illegal poaching in the deer yard, to all of which Pierre shrugged his shoulders indifferently. Then, speaking slowly, that every word might sink in, Alec charged him with being an accomplice to attempted murder and the theft of the black fox. This roused the Frenchman to vehement denial. He swore by the name of his patron saint that he knew nothing of the black fox and had had no part in the theft. He declared that he didn't even know that a black fox had been seen in the hollow, and as for the assault on Spar, he was as innocent as a newborn babe. Then Alec told him the story of the killing of the fox and the murderous attack by the Indian, concluding by stating his belief that the latter had hidden the skin and intended to desert his companion at the first opportunity, and thus avoid having to share his ill-gotten gains. Pierre's face grew black with ill-suppressed rage, not, as his captors well knew, at the dastardly crime, but at the evident intention of his partner to double-cross him. Alec artfully pointed out the serious situation in which he, Pierre, was. If turned over to the officers of the law, he would undoubtedly have to face the charge of being an accessory to the Indian's crime. He wound up with the suggestion that if Pierre would endeavor to help him recover the skin, they would in return be content to allow him to get out of the country. If he refused, they would hold him and turn him over to the authorities. It did not take Pierre long to make up his mind. He saw clearly that he had nothing to gain by refusing, and everything to lose. Moreover, the spirit of revenge was strong within him. After a few minutes of hesitation, he sullenly agreed to do whatever was required of him. "Tell him," said Pat, "that he is to go out there and demand of that skulking redskin that he is to come out and surrender. Tell him to make it clear that the camp is surrounded and the jig is up, that we're going to get him anyway, dead or alive, and we don't much care which. Tell him that he is not to go nearer than 10 yards to the cabin, that we've got him covered, and if he makes any break, it'll be his last one." Alec translated this, and Pierre nodded. Then he walked forward through the thicket into the open, at Alec's command coming to a halt some 30 feet from the cabin door, where he hailed the Indian in the latter's own language. There was a muffled reply, and after some delay the cabin door was opened a crack and a rifle barrel thrust through. Then followed a heated parley in the Indian tongue, of which Alec understood enough to gather the substance. "He's laying it on thick," he chuckled. "Says that the sheriff and the deputies are here and have got the camp surrounded, and that unless he comes out, they'll shoot him on sight. The Injun has passed him the lie. He's mocking Pierre for being caught by a couple of make-believe trappers, ken that's you and me, Pat, and a lot of infants. He says that he hasn't got the black fox and doesn't know anything about it. Pierre is giving him a beautiful tongue-lashing and calling him everything bad this side of purgatory. 'Tis a shame you didn't understand a little of the lingo, Pat. Ha! The Red says he'll shoot on sight and is warning Pierre to get back before he takes a pot shot at him, and by the saints I believe he means it." As a matter of fact, at this point they saw the rifle barrel raised. Pierre abruptly turned and without once looking back rejoined the 2 men in the thicket. He was in a towering rage and spat out French invectives at a rate to defy description. He reported the result of his mission, stating his opinion that the Indian could hold out indefinitely, as there was a plentiful supply of grub in the cabin and enough firewood to keep him from freezing for longer than his besiegers would care to stay. "Will he shoot, do you think, if we rush the cabin?" asked Pat meditatively. As if in reply, the rifle at the cabin door spat fire, and a bullet whizzed through the thicket so close to Pat that instinctively he ducked. He had carelessly exposed himself to the view of the outlaw. Almost instantly Alec's rifle replied, and a splinter flew from the doorframe. "That'll teach him that 'tis no make-believe shooter out here," he growled. The door still remained open a crack, evidently to allow the inmate to observe what was going on in front, the only vulnerable point of attack, there being no windows in the cabin. Pat worked round to a point where he could put a bullet through this crack by way of warning, and his shot was followed by the closing of the door. "That reminds me," said he with a comical grimace as he slipped into the Rogue, "of the first skunk I ever caught. 'Twas in a box trap, and having got the little beastie in the trap, I didn't know how in the mischief to get him out." Meanwhile, the three boys had obediently remained at their posts. They had witnessed the parley and the shooting, but just what it all meant and what the results were, they could only guess. They were ashake with excitement and fairly ached with curiosity. Shortly after the last shot, Pat joined them and briefly explained what had happened and the present situation. "There's only one thing we can do now," said he, "and that is to smoke the old fox out. This is where you fellows, or one of you anyway, will have a chance to take a hand. The snow is banked clear to the roof here and at the back, and it'll be no trick at all for one of you to steal down there to the chimney. He's got a fire there now, but the minute he suspects what is up, he'll put that out. We've got to give him something he can't put out. I've got an old sweater that's worn out. A couple of you can slip around down where we pass those cedars and strip off enough bark and that hanging moss to stuff it out so that you can make a ball of it, and stuff it down the chimney with a pole so that it will stick halfway. On top of that, you can drop some rolls of lighted birch bark and have ready the thickest fir boughs you can find to clap on top of the chimney. Walt, you better tend to putting the stuff down the chimney, and mind you work fast. And don't lean over it. When he finds out what's up, he's likely to try a pot shot up the chimney in the hope of blowing the stuff out. If you have good heavy boughs on top, he can't do it. Alec and I'll watch the front to get him when he comes out. Have plenty of bark and get it going before you toss the rolls in. As long as you don't get over the chimney and keep off the roof, there'll be no danger. The roof is of bark, and he may take a chance shot up through it, so work from the drift on this end." Hal and Spar went after the moss, while Upton made the trip over to the clump of birches and stripped off the bark. Then, with his belt axe, he cut a number of fir boughs. By the time the others returned, he had the bark and boughs ready and had prepared a stick with which to push down the moss-filled sweater. If he should push this too far, it would drop down into the fireplace. On the other hand, he wanted to get far enough down so that the flames from the bark would not immediately fire the fir boughs on top. Breaking through the snow crust, he mixed snow with the moss and also rolled the sweater in snow. The boys had brought more moss than was needed for stuffing the sweater, and this Upton also mixed with the snow and placed in a loose mass at the foot of the chimney. When all was ready, he had Hal and Spar each light a couple of the birch rolls ready to hand to him. As soon as these were going, he stuffed the sweater down the chimney, pushing it down with a stick as far as he dared. Then, seizing the burning bark rolls, he tossed them down the top, crammed the loose moss in, and clapped the fir boughs over all. On top of the latter, he tossed some snow. Meanwhile, Pat had created a diversion in the front of the cabin by shouting threats of what they would do to the redskin if he didn't come out and surrender. Upton had worked quickly and was through before the outlaw fully sensed what was up. At first he evidently thought that they had merely covered the top of the chimney to smoke him out with his own fire, and the hissing sound which came up to them through the chimney proclaimed the quenching of this with water. Then, discovering that the smoke was increasing instead of decreasing, he did exactly what Pat had foreseen, attempted to blow the chimney clear by firing his rifle up it. However, he only succeeded in setting fire to the sweater from underneath, and this, because of its nature, merely smoldered. It was now merely a question of whether the sweater and moss would burn and drop before the smoke in the cabin became too dense for a human being to live in it. Birch bark, as every Boy Scout knows, is one of the most inflammable of materials. It burns like fat, and also like fat it throws off a thick smoke. This was working up now in little puffs through the fir boughs, but the great bulk of it must be pouring into the cabin, for Upton had taken care in stuffing the sweater down not to wholly block the passage. Now and then a little tongue of flame licked up through the fir boughs and was promptly extinguished with a handful of snow. The snow-damp moss shoved down on the bark was adding to the smoke, and from the sounds in the cabin it was clear that the occupant was in difficulties. Presently Spar called attention to smoke pouring up at the front end of the cabin. The door had been set ajar to let out the smoke. Almost immediately there was a shot from the thicket where Pat was hiding, followed by a second shot, and then the bang of the door as it was once more shut. But it did not remain closed long. No human being could long survive in such an atmosphere as now prevailed in the little cabin. This time the door was flung wide open, and in the midst of the cloud of smoke that poured out, the Indian staggered forth, gasping and choking. Pat at once stepped from hiding, covering the outlaw with his rifle, but for this there was no real need. Until he should get some pure air into his lungs, he was quite helpless. He threw himself down in the snow and gasped weakly. A sorrier-looking spectacle could hardly be imagined. His eyes were inflamed, blood red. His face and clothing were smeared with soot and ashes. One cheek was bleeding from a wound made, as it afterward appeared, by a splinter torn off from the door frame by one of Pat's bullets. Alec wasted no time in securing the prisoner's hands behind him, and then deftly searched him for hidden weapons, finding none but a knife. It reminded him of the knife Pierre had tossed at his feet when he was captured at the spring, and he sent Sparrer to get it. As soon as the capture was made, the three boys had rushed forward, forgetting that they were under orders to remain at their posts until signaled. Somewhat sternly, but with a twinkle in his eyes that belied the severity of his voice, Pat now reminded them of this and ordered Upton back to clear the boughs from the top of the chimney. By this time the sweater had burned through, and the whole mass had dropped into the fireplace, where it continued to burn, the smoke rolling out of the open door in a dense cloud. With the removal of the boughs from the top of the chimney, a draft was re-established, and the smoke sought its natural outlet. It was some time, however, before the interior of the cabin could be examined with any comfort, and Pat took advantage of this to quiz the Indian. So far as results were obtained, he might as well have talked to a wooden post. The redskin stolidly refused to answer questions. When confronted with Sparrer, he denied ever having seen him before, much to that young man's disgust. He steadfastly denied all knowledge of the Black Fox and refused to admit that he had ever been in Smuggler's Hollow. At last Pat gave up in disgust. The cabin had sufficiently cleared of smoke by this time to permit of a search being made. Leaving Alec to stand guard over the prisoners, Pat and the three boys entered and began their investigations. 2 rifles stood inside the door, and these Pat emptied of cartridges and stood them outside against the end of the cabin. Then, without ceremony, he pulled the bedding from the 2 low bunks and tossed it out in the snow. This was followed by everything else the cabin contained until it was stripped bare. Under the 2 bunks they found part of the object of their search, many cased furs. There were marten, mink, fisher, a couple of otter, 3 red fox, 2 lynx, and a number of muskrat, a pile that altogether represented a tidy sum from a trapper's point of view. But the black fox was not among them. Pat glowered at the prisoners savagely as he noted that some of the skins had been carelessly handled, and therefore would not bring what they would had they been properly treated. Then he resumed his search of the cabin. The only thing further in the way of skins were 2 tightly rolled deer hides freshly taken from the animals, one being that of a fawn. "Do you mind what I told you had happened at the deer yard?" growled Pat as he tossed the skins out of the door. Convinced at last that the skin of the black fox was not in the camp, they regretfully gave up the search there and emerged from the cabin. Alec read the disappointment and chagrin in their faces. So, too, did Big Pierre, who had been awaiting the result of their search with ill-concealed impatience. He had scarcely looked at his partner since the latter had been captured. Now he turned and spoke rapidly in French to Alec. "He says," explained the latter, "that if the Injun really has got the skin, he has hidden it outside somewhere, and if we'll agree to let him go, he'll help us hunt for it. He says that it is probably in a hollow tree somewhere near, but swears he doesn't know where. He thinks that the Injun meant to wait until he, Pierre, was away from camp, and then get it and light out." "I shouldn't wonder if he's right at that," exclaimed Hal. "What do you think of the proposition, Pat?" "He may be right enough about the Injun, but I wouldn't trust him the length of me nose," Pat growled. "Let me talk a bit more to the Injun." He strode up in front of the captive and shook brawny fists beneath his nose. "We've got you, and we're going to turn you over to the sheriff unless you come across mighty quick with that skin," he thundered. Then, dropping into simple speech that the Indian could not misunderstand, he continued. "You steal much fur. Big Pierre say so if we let him go." Alec translated, and Pierre nodded. The Indian glanced at his late partner and saw the nod. A vindictive look swept across his face and left it as expressionless as before. "You tried to kill White Boy," He go to court and swear. Injun go to prison for long time, years and years. Black Fox only thing can save Injun." The Indian appeared to consider the triple indictment, but no hint of what was passing in his mind appeared in his face. It was as stolid and expressionless as ever. At length he spoke. "You give Injun gun and all his things, and let go if he tells something?" he inquired. "We'll see about it," Pat growled. "No promise, Injun no tell," was the prompt response. It was Pat's turn to consider. Finally he made up his mind. "Listen, Alec," said he. "You tell Pierre that we'll give him their guns, but no cartridges, and we'll let them take their personal belongings and as much grub as they can carry, and let them go on condition that they will admit to having stolen the skins from our traps, that they will agree to get out of these parts and never come back, and that the Indian shows us where the fox is. Otherwise, we'll take them to the camp and hold them prisoners while one of us goes out for the sheriff. Tell him to tell the Injun." Alec turned to Pierre and spoke rapidly. The latter interjected a question now and then, and when Alec had finished, made a brief reply. "He says," Alec explained, "that he agrees. Though he thinks we ought to let them have some cartridges, he admits the stealing of the furs, but still protests that he wasn't in the Fox affair and wants to know if we'll let him go in case the Injun refuses to come across." "Tell him yes," replied Pat. This Alec did, and Pierre at once turned to the Indian and addressed him in his own tongue. Alec picked up enough to know that Pierre was putting the case in its strongest light and dwelling on the length of time in prison likely to follow conviction. When he finished, the Indian turned to Pat. "You come," he said simply, and turned toward the woods. End of chapter 18.